In 1959, the CIA is confronting a new enemy, Fidel Castro, the man who threatens to spread communism across America's backyard.
The fear for the United States was that a Cuban-style revolution would explode throughout Latin America.
The US President Dwight Eisenhower wants him assassinated, and the CIA is given a job. But they need someone who can break through his tight security. Their unlikely weapon, a 19-year-old woman named Marita Lorenz.
She was the natural choice because she could get through all of the protective layers that Fidel had around him, and she could get into his bed.
This is the story of one of the most extraordinary CIA operations of them all. It will involve the mafia, a Watergate burglar, and Castro's lover.
He looked at me. Did you come to kill me?
This, the most bizarre CIA assassination attempt of them all, begins with a chance encounter that took place in the port of Cuba's capital city, Havana. A 19-year-old German-American woman named Marita Lorenz is on the deck of her father's cruise liner, the MS Berlin.
I was on board the ship. My father was sleeping. I saw this launch coming, and it was coming closer and closer. And then finally, they stood up and waved. And I saw that they all had guns and all wore green uniforms and had beards. The launch came up very close, and he just held on to the railing. He looked up, and I looked down. He said, "I'm coming up." And I said, "No." And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, who are you?" And he just looked at me, and he said, "This is Comandante Fidel Castro."
Fidel Castro is the most notorious revolutionary in the world. Just 1 month earlier, at the age of 32, he seizes power in Cuba in January 1959. He overthrows an American-backed dictator and turns his people against the United States. Castro becomes Prime Minister of Cuba and forms a close economic and military alliance with the Soviet Union. Now his friendship with the Soviets and his desire to spread his communist revolution throughout Latin America is sending shockwaves back to the United States.
We didn't realize there was a threat right in the United States backyard until it was too late and Castro had seized power. We had to focus our attention because this had the potential to become a communist base in our hemisphere.
Cuba is only 90 miles away from the American coast.
Cuba was so close to the United States and was potentially a place where missiles could be launched directly against the United States. I mean, what a strategic advantage Fidel had.
Eisenhower recognizes that Castro is a serious emerging threat to the US that needs to be dealt with. But the young Marita knows nothing about this man who's about to come on board her father's ship.
Very flirtatious, looking at my eyes, trying to size me up.
As they come together, 19-year-old Marita Lorenz is swept away by Castro's charisma.
And I I saw his eyes, and that was it. Lost in love. I fell in love. And that's the first time I kissed him. And then my father stormed in. And that's that picture of me sitting at the table with the first officer and Fidel, and immediately I pulled my hand away so Papa wouldn't see.
Marita's father invites Castro to stay for dinner that evening before he takes his ship and his daughter back to New York.
I remember standing on the top deck when we pulled out of the harbor and missing him and feeling terrible. I've got to see him again.
As soon as Marita returns to the city, Fidel Castro calls and invites her back to Cuba. This is the beginning of a passionate love affair.
I hadn't even unpacked. He said, "How are you? I miss you." And with his bad English, asked me to come back. I send you airplane. And I ended up back in Havana with the same suitcase I hadn't unpacked.
A week later, Marita leaves her family's ship and moves into Castro's penthouse apartments on the 24th floor of the Havana Hilton.
I felt absolutely terrified, happy, frustrated, crazy, and defying my parents without telling them. I felt very guilty. I was taken to a suite, 2408, which linked to 2406 with doors. The first thing I remember, the smell of cigars. This is his place. I look around and there's all his uniforms and this beautiful music. It was a record that never stopped. It played over and over and over again. And boots turned upside down and ashtrays with cigars in it. And then I see toys. Little tanks. And then a bazooka sticking out from under the bed. This was where Fidel was living, and that kind of scared me a little bit, but I don't have anywhere to go. Even if I tried, the whole hall was filled with bodyguards, and it was Fidel's suite. And they just said, wait, and don't go out, just wait. And I did just that. I waited and waited and waited. All of a sudden, I hear the door swing open. And he came in and picked me up and swung me around. And I miss you so much, and love talk. And that's a moment I'll never forget.
The CIA has been looking for ways of getting to Castro, and they've just stumbled on their first big break.
He would have very close access to Fidel. Fidel, I'm sure, had very, very tight security. He would have bodyguards with him, protective detail wherever he went.
Oh, Fidel Castro, from the very beginning, enjoyed very, very good personal security. Very good. It's comparable to the best anywhere in the world. He created one of the world's best intelligence and counterintelligence organizations.
Back in Washington, CIA agents realize that 19-year-old Marita Lorenz may be exactly what they are looking for.
Here you have one of the prime targets by the U.S. government and the CIA, Fidel Castro himself. So anybody that's accompanying him, around him, or anywhere connected with him is going to be known in detail by U.S. intelligence.
The CIA realizes Marita could be a valuable asset, and they are studying her every move.
Marita had a romantic relationship with him. A romantic relationship would actually get her into his bedroom, so she would be able to bypass all of his security layers. She would be the ultimate recruitment target for the CIA and for the US government. No one could track him down except for this one person who was his lover.
In April 1959, Fidel Castro is invited to the US by the Society of Newspaper Editors. Castro accepts the invitation, hoping to win over American public opinion as tensions between the two countries steadily rise. Marita accompanies him on their 11-day visit. The CIA is, of course, there too.
What the CIA would use is what's called the foreign agent recruitment cycle. And that cycle consists of first spotting a target, a person that has direct access to the person that you're after. The spotting could have very possibly occurred when Marita was either in Havana, or be a strong possibility it could occur when she traveled to the United States with Fidel and he met with Nixon.
He came to New York in anticipation of seeing President Eisenhower. And instead, Eisenhower rejected him and pushed him off to Nixon, which absolutely infuriated Fidel. He felt very angry that he wasn't accepted with open arms as the new leader of Cuba.
That would have been a prime opportunity for her to be spotted without question. He was meeting with Nixon. That was a high-level meeting, and you can be sure that U.S. intelligence was all over that visit. Then they would assess the person, their vulnerabilities, whether they were available for recruitment. Then they would develop that person, befriend them, find certain switches maybe that they could use. And then finally they'd make the pitch, would you come over and work with us and can we use you in our operation?
After 2 blissful months, Marita learns that she is pregnant with Castro's child.
I was happy to be pregnant, very happy. I wanted it. I wondered what it was going to be. He said, oh, wonderful. Half German, half Cuban. I said, and American. And he was very happy. He said, now I have to build another hospital.
But Marita realizes there are limitations to being Fidel Castro's lover.
I understood that he belonged to Cuba. He made that very clear. He belonged to everybody and to Cuba first, and to nobody but to Cuba.
By now, the US is becoming increasingly concerned by Castro's popularity.
Fidel Castro was a titanic figure. When he won power on New Year's Day in 1959, he had come down from the mountains of Cuba after a 2-year insurgency. He was the hero of the Cuban population. He was a young man, he was 32 years old, and there was an appeal, the beard and the costume that he cultivated very, very carefully, almost never being seen out of that guerrilla costume. He was admired in much of Latin America, especially among the youth, the university students, the nationalists, and of course the radical left. It was just weeks after he won power, and Fidel began very stridently attacking the United States in speeches. He did this in speech after speech. He denounced the United States.
If the Americans don't like what is happening in Cuba, they can land the Marines and then there will be 200,000 gringos dead. Even if the Yankee imperialists prepare a bloody drama for America, they will not succeed in crushing the people's struggles. They will only arouse universal hatred against themselves. And such a drama will also mark the death of their greedy and carnivorous system. It is the end of 1959, and US-Cuban relations are deteriorating rapidly.
It looked pretty clear now that Fidel was abandoning any pretense of democracy, of fair government, of human rights. He began to support violent incursions, interventions against other Latin American leaders. He was aggressively exporting the Cuban Revolution to other countries. And the thinking in Washington was becoming much more focused on, we've got to do something about this.
It is now that the US government realizes that Castro must be removed.
The CIA were highly regarded in Washington in those days, and the belief was that covert action against Castro was the best instrument to use.
What happens next is a bizarre and strange mystery, but one that eventually leads to Marita being put in contact with the CIA. Marita is alone in Castro's penthouse apartments in the Havana Hilton. The birth of their child is predicted for the beginning of December, and Marita has just ordered her room service breakfast.
Everything was fine. Getting big, getting ready for the baby. I had ordered breakfast, and I drank the milk. I felt dizzy. I said, well, maybe this is just because of the pregnancy. But no. All I remember was falling backwards on the bed, and I was out. And then I woke up in a car, and I was being driven somewhere. I was like half asleep, and then I was out.
Marita's memory of what happens next is very hazy. She has glimpses of events that she can only partially recall.
The next thing I remember is lights, a light above me, and arguing back and forth, cursing in Spanish. They were arguing about Fidel. I don't know if they're arguing at him or with him or against him or for him or what. I couldn't make it out. And I don't know if my clothes were on or off, or somebody's moving my body back and forth.
Marita is 7.5 months pregnant and senses that something shocking is happening to her baby.
Terrible pain, terrible pain. But I was like half gone. I thought the baby was born. For a moment, I heard a baby cry. I had a needle in my arm, and the pain was unbearable. And I felt wet. It made me frightened, and I started to cry. And that's all I remember. And then I woke up back in my suite.
Marita is so ill, one of Castro's aides arranges for her to fly back to New York for urgent medical treatment. FBI agents are there as her plane touches down.
The FBI met me at the airport, and I went straight to Roosevelt Hospital under FBI protection, surrounded by them.
Unbeknown to Marita, this is the beginning of her involvement with the CIA plot to kill Castro. After a forced abortion, performed when she was drugged and kidnapped from Castro's residence, Marita is now suffering from blood poisoning and requires immediate surgery. And she's about to find out what has really happened to her.
It is apparent that she underwent a forced abortion in Havana. And then the question would be, was that done by the Cuban government? Was that done by the US government or the CIA? And based on my knowledge of the kind of operations that happened back then, personally, I don't think the CIA would have done that. It would be my opinion, perhaps that Castro himself may have been behind that. He had several lovers, and it's very possible that Marita was not the only one, and if a child was born, it could have caused him possibly some political ramifications.
The CIA agents begin to use the abortion as a way to turn her against Castro.
If Castro was behind this forced abortion, then that would be the ultimate development tool to use with Marita, because that would be a classic betrayal, not just by her romantic lover, but also the loss of her child caused by Fidel Castro.
The CIA now initiates its plan to turn Marita into their assassin.
The next step in the recruitment cycle is called development. And at that point, they would approach Marita and begin developing her.
First, the CIA agents play the good cop and try to win her confidence.
After the hospital stay, I was allowed to go home under 24-hour guard and recover physically and mentally and emotionally. Had the agents around me every day giving me so-called vitamins. And they took turns watching me day and night and day and night.
The agency would now know the vulnerabilities that Marita had after the assessment, and to develop her, they would begin appealing to those vulnerabilities.
I was heartbroken. I was sad. I was lonely.
She was betrayed. She had an abortion, a child that obviously she loved and wanted to keep. She was emotionally traumatized. She wound up in a U.S. hospital alone. So they'd begin appealing to that.
They started this program of, let's get even with him. He did this to you. Let's get even with him.
He didn't do anything about it, left her in the cold. So he wasn't the person that she thought he was.
I was 19. I was very naive when it came to matters of politics or international foreign policy affairs or love affairs.
They're going to try to convince her that the United States is the good guy and Fidel Castro is the bad guy.
They repeated things over and over and over again about Fidel doing this, Fidel that, Fidel this. I would have these crying jags where I would curl up into a ball and cry my eyes out and wanting the baby and throwing things, you know, and they would give me pills to calm me down. They would say that's the anger coming out and you have to do something to get rid of that anger, you know.
Before the CIA agents can go any further with Marita, they need to know that she has been telling them the truth about her past.
The next very important step is you have to vet the person, the target. It's critically important because we've had many times, many cases where a person has come over and they've become a double agent or were a double agent. So to vet, in this case, Marita, the agency would have to corroborate all the information she provided. Her trips back to Havana, all her records would be checked, her travel records, the people that knew her over there, if we had access to them, and the procedure would not proceed forward until the agency was absolutely convinced that the information she was providing was credible.
Having worked on her personal relationship with Castro, planting the seed that he is the bad guy, they now need to get her on their side politically. The CIA agents begin to dig deeper into Marita's past. Marita tells them she was born in Germany on the 18th of August 1939. And 2 weeks later, her country invaded Poland.
I'm a child of the war. All I remember is hard times.
The agents learn that her father, Heinrich, was a German submarine captain. Marita informs them that her mother, Alice, was a spy for both the French resistance and the British intelligence during World War II.
My first memories of her were in the basement where she would do Morse code, da-da, da-da-da-da-da.
She tells them that in 1944 her mother's cover was blown and that she was thrown into the Nazi German Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Marita, then only 5 years old, accompanied her there.
I was incarcerated in an SS home and then transferred to Belsen.
At the end of the war in 1945, the Belsen concentration camp was liberated, and Marita says she was finally rescued.
It was this British ambulance driver that found me half dead under a bunk in Belsen and pulled me out.
In 1950, the family moves to the United States, settling eventually in New York, and life begins to improve for Marita. The story of Marita's brutal childhood in Germany allows the CIA agents to play on her loyalty to her new country, the country that's made her happy, and the country that Castro is now threatening to destroy. Planting the seed that Castro is the bad guy in their relationship, they now broaden their approach to include his hatred of America.
They'd bring out the information such as Castro was determined on invading the United States, overturning the U.S. government. He was a bad guy. He was affiliated with the Russians. He hadn't told her any of that information. She didn't know any of that.
You didn't know that? No, you're too dumb, too blind, you know? They would curse at me. They would keep me in the room. They wouldn't open the window. I wouldn't go out. They would just bring food, and I felt confined. And all they ever talked about, look, here's more proof. See, he's a commie. He's nothing but a damn commie. And you have to do something.
Having now softened Marita up, the agents come clean and ask her to join them.
The final step in the recruitment process would be the pitch. And that's when you actually ask the person to come over and work for the CIA, U.S. intelligence, and ultimately the U.S. government.
The CIA said to me, now you can work for us.
After weeks of developing Marita, she agrees to join them. Only now do the CIA agents finally disclose the real purpose of their mission.
We want you to take him out. And I said, you what? You trying to tell me to kill him? And they said, well, we don't use those words. It's just kind of neutralizing him. Look, can you just put something in his food and put him to sleep? You would never know, and you would leave. I said, I can't kill him.
The CIA now ramp up the horror of a world under Castro's control and try to explain to Marita that the future of the United States is at stake.
They would have to have her so convinced that Castro had absolutely betrayed her, that his sole aim was to invade the United States and overturn the U.S. government, that the lives of millions of American people were at stake, that the U.S. Constitution was at stake, and possibly a nuclear war was at stake. And she was one of the only ones that could stop that.
And I started to believe them. You're going to be a good citizen, and I wanted to be good. I didn't want to be bad.
You have to do this. You have to do this not just for you and your freedom, but for the United States and the people in the United States.
90 miles away, you know, that's how close he is. You could almost walk there, you could jump a puddle, you know. That's how close he is. Just think of it, Marita. You will save this country from the evils of communism. And how proud my mother would be, and how proud we would be. And I would have a star in the CIA building in Langley.
Eventually, it seems the CIA tactics have worked.
They slowly convinced me, and I said, well, maybe they weren't all that wrong. If Fidel's unpredictable, you could push that button. If I went ahead and just slipped him something to go to sleep, I would prevent an invasion. And then I thought, I have to go back and kill him.
Towards the end of December 1959, the CIA needs to be sure that she's a willing agent, so they send her back to Cuba. Marita enters the country as an American tourist, but her real task is to gauge how Castro will react to seeing his lover after 6 weeks recuperating in New York.
They wanted me to not be absent too long from Fidel. They didn't want him to think that I had become a turncoat and working for them now.
If Marita was sent by the agency back to Havana, that would be a vetting process. Obviously, if she was a double agent or if she had provided false information and went back to Havana, she would stay there.
I had the keys to the suite, room 2408, and I could just walk in and walk out. And the toys are still there, the music is still there, the boots are still there, his clothes are still in the closet.
So if she went there and she behaved the way that her handlers in the U.S. had told her to do, did the things that they told her to do, and then if she came back, then that would be a very, very good indication that she was indeed now properly assessed and recruited.
Marita passes the test. The CIA now prepares the assassination plan. At the beginning of January 1960, the CIA instructs Marita to travel to Miami to meet a man called Frank Sturgis. A former US Marine, Sturgis fights alongside Fidel Castro in the 1950s and becomes his chief of Air Force intelligence. But when Sturgis realizes the direction Castro's revolution is heading, he changes sides, and now he's working for the CIA.
Some people in the press call him a real-life James Bond, and he certainly was. He used over 30 different aliases in his career as a spy and as an assassin. I lived with Frank for a year in Miami when I was in college. He had a whole drawer full of phony IDs. I mean, some of them were from South American countries. I mean, the man was clearly, he was a man of action. He didn't just sit around and talk about his beliefs. He firmly and deeply believed in the freedoms that we have here in the United States and didn't like communism. He didn't like the total control of the individual's life and took a stand against those things and basically waged a war against Fidel Castro. When Marita Lorenz met with Frank Sturgis in January of 1960 to proceed with this plot to assassinate Fidel Castro, Frank at that point was working hand in hand with the CIA in an attempt to overthrow the Fidel Castro government. He told me that Marita was a very intelligent, beautiful, secure 19, 20-year-old woman. He was very impressed with her and in terms of her maturity for her young age. She basically was thrust onto a kind of a world stage in terms of the relationship she had with Fidel.
Sturgis's job is to come up with a suitable murder weapon for Marita to use against Castro. Should it be a gun? A knife? Eventually, he decides on poison pills. To get hold of the poison, Sturgis turns to an unlikely source to obtain it.
When Frank Sturgis told me the story, I said, poison, where do you come up with poison, Frank? And he looked at me and said, well, I got him from some friends. And I said, friends? He said, let's just say close family of friends. And of course I knew he was talking about the mafia.
The thought that the CIA working with the mafia is not such a far-fetched idea. The mob had controlled much of Cuba's gambling interests for 50 years. But when Castro came to power, he kicked them out. The mob knows that if Castro is taken out, they can move back in.
The mafia and the CIA had a community of interest in terms of getting rid of Fidel. And so I think all those things kind of gelled together in this particular plot.
It is clear, and there is documented evidence, that between 1960 and 1965, the CIA did approach the mafia to obtain the poison pills to use against specifically Castro. The reason that they would do that, obviously, is the mafia could get these poisons illegally, which the United States could not do, or even the CIA officers would prefer not to do.
Sturgis gives Marita the pills containing botulism toxin. The weapon is very carefully chosen. They are not traceable. They would dissolve completely and invisibly in liquid. There will be no odor or taste. Critically, they will be easy to use for someone emotionally involved, because the death will not be unpleasant.
They would portray to her that, look, this is a very easy way to go. You're not going to be pulling a trigger on a gun. There's no violence in this, and it's a merciful way to do it, to use poison. Really, this is the most painless, soft way to do it. Castro won't suffer at all.
The CIA has got their agent and their murder weapon. All that is left now is to set their assassin in motion. The problem now facing the CIA is that Castro has no routine, no set pattern, which drives the agents wild with frustration. He is in Havana one minute, then across the other side of the island the next. Even his closest associates have little idea where he will be spending the night.
He had no hours, he had no timing. Nobody could make an appointment with him. He was always 6 or 8 hours late. His watches meant nothing. He would come and go as he pleased and he wished. Nobody ever knew what he was going to do.
He was a pretty hard target, so they would have to find out a routine, a habit, something that would occur pretty regularly so they could have things set up to occur at that time or that place.
Eventually, CIA agents spot a pattern. Castro gives regular public television broadcasts to tell his people how they are all benefiting from the revolution. The CIA agents discover that whenever he is going to make a live television speech, he stays at his penthouse in the Havana Hilton. Just after New Year, the CIA sends Marita back to Havana to assassinate Castro. She is told they have intelligence that he will be at the penthouse that night.
This was one of the most tense times in U.S. history in terms of intelligence and military involvement in the Cold War, our relationship with Russia and their connection to Cuba. So this operation would have been of utmost importance to the CIA and to the U.S. government.
I was in the plane. I was going to go to kill Fidel, you know. The pills made me nervous.
Marita, terrified she will be stopped going through customs, decides on an extra precaution to try and conceal the poison pills.
I went into the bathroom and I put them in a cold cream jar. And I felt better. I felt I'd be okay going through customs.
The 90-mile trip from Miami to Havana takes about 30 minutes. Marita makes it through customs unchecked. It seems her trick with the cold cream has worked. Marita now heads to the Havana Hilton and Fidel Castro's penthouse suite.
I felt important. I almost felt like I was in a grasp that I couldn't get out of, and that I was going to be saving American lives if I took this one life. I walked right in and snuck in the bathroom, closed the door, hoping Fidel didn't walk in right now. I was nervous because I have this man's life in my hands, all because of these little tiny pills. My heart was crying. Oh God, I was absolutely scared.
Marita's mission is to place the poison pills in Castro's drink to assassinate him. But they are covered in cold cream, which is sticking to the pills like glue.
I tried to wipe the cold cream off the pills. Oh. I was panicking. My God, there was no way I could grasp the pills.
Marita now desperately tries to abort the mission.
And I just took them like that and they wouldn't go down, and they kept floating. I was panicking. I thought I heard the door, and Fidel was coming in. I kept pushing the lever down, and one went down, and the other one didn't. And I smelled like cold cream, and Fidel walks in. I said, Fidel, I love you, I'm back. I'm gonna stay, this and that, you know. He lay down on the bed like nothing. He said, you're back. What you been up to, hanging around those Miami people? And when he said that, oh my God, he knows. He knows. And he just looked at me and shook his head. And then he just took off the gun belt and threw it over the lamp. And he took the gun out of the holster. I thought that he's gonna shoot me. But then he flipped it around and he gave it to me. He looked at me and he said, did you come to kill me? He left himself wide open, vulnerable. He turned to his side, you know, like she's got the gun in her hand, what is she gonna do? Who is she really? He was, for a split second, a little nervous. And then he just took a puff of smoke on a cigar and closed his eyes. He said, nobody can kill me. Nunca. Nobody ever can kill me. I ejected the magazine out of the gun, and then I put the gun back in the holster, and then he said, come here. And that was the end of that. I could have killed him, but I didn't kill him. I went to bed with him. He took the phone off the hook. I was so relieved about the pills. I was even afraid that my makeup case would come walking out of the bathroom. But I made love to him. And it was as beautiful as ever, but something was missing. And that was the baby.
On the same evening, Marita flies back to Miami and tells the CIA she has failed to kill Castro.
Frank felt that Marita lost her nerve on this particular assignment, mainly because of her feelings about Fidel. The old emotions, if you will, took over, and she just wasn't willing to take the step to actually to end his life.
You know, the CIA is not always successful in what it does, and it has failed a number of times. We never know about that because it's an enclosed, secret world. So failure is something that the CIA is used to. So if Marita was not successful in her operation, the agency would just move on to the next plan. That's exactly what they did.
Marita's failure causes the CIA to realize they will need to continue exploring ways to get to Castro. Marita's was the first assassination attempt on Castro's life, and is the closest anyone has managed to get to him. Since then, there's been an estimated 638 plots to kill Castro, ranging from an all-out invasion to exploding cigars, poisoned pens, and sniper attacks. All have failed, and Castro, who steps down in 2008 as one of the longest-serving heads of state in the world, is still alive today.
He's survived quite a few assassination attempts. Only a few of them were sponsored by the American government. Many others were sponsored by Cuban exiles who were violently opposed to the Castro government. Fidel survived because he created a very powerful and thoroughly ruthless machine for internal security. He was absolutely ruthless. Whenever he even had a scent of opposition, whether it was a group of Cubans somewhere on the island or some prominent individual in the Cuban leadership, even a hint of opposition was enough to result in that person's political extermination and possibly even their execution.
The year after Frank Sturgis gave Marita the poison pills, he helped plan the CIA-funded Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba to overthrow the Castro government. He was later arrested as one of the Watergate burglars, sent by President Richard Nixon to break into the Democratic National Headquarters in Washington. Sturgis was imprisoned for 13 months. As for Marita, she continued to work against the Castro government, and during a fundraising mission met another dictator, former president of Venezuela, Marcos Pérez Jiménez. Marita fell in love with Pérez. They had a daughter and a brief affair, and then he was imprisoned on charges of embezzling $200 million. In 2000, Marita returned to Havana in the hope of meeting with Fidel Castro again, but he refused to see her. Today, she is still living in New York. Iran, 1979. The worst hostage crisis in American history begins. Unknown to the world at the time, US Embassy staff escape and find their way to the house of Canadian diplomats, where they spend 85 days in hiding.
The longer that we were in hiding, the more the potential was that we would be found.
When the Central Intelligence Agency learn of the Americans on the run, they assign one of their top escape agents, Tony Mendez, to get them out. He comes up with an extraordinary plan to walk the diplomats out of Iran in broad daylight, posing as a Hollywood film crew.
It was a perfect example of truth being stranger than fiction.
The CIA now pushes its tradecraft to the limit as they set out to disguise and train 6 ordinary Americans in the art of escape. This is the real-life story of what would later become an Oscar-winning Hollywood sensation. But what isn't in the Hollywood version are the extraordinary details of an operation the CIA kept hidden away in classified files until now.
It's the secret story of how the CIA fooled everyone.
In late 1979, thousands of anti-American protesters in Iran are gathering outside the US Embassy. Demonstrations against America are common. Iran is still in the throes of an Islamic revolution, and America is being accused of aiding and abetting the hated exiled dictator, the Shah Reza Pahlavi. This is one of hundreds of protests organized by militant revolutionary students. But this time, it's different.
Few of them had makeshift weapons, bike chains or a baseball bat, though some of them did have pistols. Massive crowd, 1,000 people, roaring, "Down with America, death to Carter."
Inside the embassy, staff can see the disturbance from the office windows. Shortly after 9 a.m., the chains of the gate are cut. A small breakaway group of student militants heads for the main embassy building, the Chancery.
They broke the window and they were able to enter into the basement. The Iranians made their way up to the second floor. I captured some Americans and said, "Let us in, otherwise, we'll harm these people."
Adjacent to the Chancery is another building, the Consulate. Inside, there are more Americans. One of them is Mark Lyjek.
We started hearing kind of a hubbub coming from the waiting area. People talking about demonstrators roaming inside the compound.
Mark Lyjek's wife, Cora, is also in the consulate.
We did hear footsteps on the roof, and we thought that maybe somebody was going to try to get in and find access into the building, so that was a bit scary.
Oh, the lights went out. Apparently the demonstrators had gotten into the power station and cut off the power.
Someone threw a brick or a rock through the window, and the Marine went running in and saw a guy climbing up a ladder.
The diplomats now realize that the embassy compound is completely overrun by demonstrators. At first, one of the US Marines guarding the consulate advises them to stay inside the building. They hear on the radio that armed militants are trying to kidnap the rest of the Americans. They now know that they're in grave danger. They must escape fast.
They realized that the Chancery had been broken into and that they really couldn't hold out any longer.
They're advised to head to the nearby British embassy with the help of a local Iranian guide. So they make their way to a side door of the consulate that leads directly onto the streets of Tehran. Only steps away are thousands and thousands of angry Iranian protesters. Among the first out are Mark and Cora Lyjek.
When I first left the embassy, I was certainly nervous. I felt very conspicuous.
We were trying not to stand out. We were trying to blend in with the people that were walking away.
Step by step, trying to get away.
They are followed by Joe Stafford, his wife Kathy, and Bob Anders. The five avoid the angry crowds now behind them and head southwest towards the British embassy, led by their Iranian guide.
She pulled me to the side, and the rest of our group also went to the side, and she says, there's a demonstration, we can't go there.
We saw a demonstration there, so we decided that was not a good idea.
In the end, they head to Bob Anders' apartment and remain there, terrified of stepping back onto the streets of Tehran. In Washington, while the embassy crisis is unfolding, It's still the early hours of Sunday morning. Calls from Iran begin to trickle in to the State Department. The president is alerted as dawn rises. And so is the Central Intelligence Agency.
Upon receiving the information that the embassy had been overrun, the CIA would have immediately been concerned for the safety of its people.
By the time America wakes up, the revolutionary students have declared a victory. Day one of the world's biggest ever international hostage crisis has begun.
They were paraded in front of the cameras, and this was a big victory for the students. I mean, they were very surprised that they'd actually been able to pull it off.
66 Americans are now being held hostage at gunpoint. At this stage, the CIA have no idea that there's a group of diplomats on the run.
We felt very dangerous, a very dangerous situation.
What happens next is not portrayed in the Hollywood movie. After their first night in hiding, the escapees make a nail-biting series of overnight stays at 5 different locations in Tehran. This includes the British ambassador's residence. This takes place over 6 grueling days.
They're literally going from house to house to house.
The most terrifying time was either Wednesday or Thursday night. All night long, the local watchman kept blowing a whistle about every 10 or 15 minutes. Our nerves were raw.
The 6 days that we spent on our own was the scariest time. The Iranians were rounding people up because the other Americans that we'd been in touch with in the first days, who were still out, were gradually being arrested, seized.
Desperate, and with no idea what to do, Bob Anders remembers a friend in the Canadian embassy and gives him a call. His name is John Sheardown.
Bob said, well, I'm not alone. There's 5 of us. And John said, bring them all.
Six days after they first step out of the US Embassy onto the streets of Tehran, the escapees finally reach the Canadian house. With their fellow Americans held hostage at gunpoint, they themselves are now effectively fugitives at large in Iran. Terrified of being caught, confused about what to do next, and exhausted, they now have just one hope: rescue by the CIA.
I had the sense anyway that Washington had sort of forgotten about us.
1 month after the embassy takeover, and the State Department is still consumed by the ever-worsening hostage crisis.
The American hostages.
No act has so galvanized the American public toward unity in the last decade as has the holding of our people as hostages in Tehran.
While State Department staff grapple with how to deal with the embassy, they also become aware of the 6 escapees through information sent from Canadian officials in Tehran. The State Department turns to the CIA. In early December, a series of top-secret flash cables arrive on the desk of an intelligence officer called Tony Mendez. Flash cables are the highest priority communications, usually restricted to wars or the most urgent of information.
Tony saw these cables on his desk, and at the top of them were these marked flash, which you almost never see. In fact, some communicators, he told me, can go their whole careers without ever seeing one.
The flash cables are about the escaped diplomats.
On December 10th, when Tony heard that there were 6 Americans stranded outside the embassy, immediately his mind would have kicked into gear.
Tony Mendez is a rising star within the CIA. He's carried out numerous undercover rescue operations, which the agency call exfiltrations, or extracting assets out of dangerous places.
His job was getting people out of tough spots, rescuing people from dangerous areas.
He's known as the Master of Disguise and works in a highly secretive specialist department known as OTS.
OTS is the Office of Technical Service, and they are the CIA's gadget makers.
These are the people in the film James Bond, which would be the Q. You know, these are they give the equipment.
With the arrival of the flash cables, Mendes and the OTS are about to receive their biggest challenge yet. Mendes is called to a meeting at the State Department.
They discuss what they thought they should do to help rescue these people. Tony immediately sort of let them know that they should let him and the experts at the CIA worry about this. And they did.
The rescue is now in Mendes's hands. Along with his team of specialists at OTS, he sets to work on a plan that will get them out in broad daylight. The first problem: the escapees are American, and the Iranian authorities will be on the lookout for any Americans trying to leave the country.
The U.S. is the hated enemy.
The second problem is that the diplomats are untrained in spy tradecraft. They simply won't have the ability of accomplished agents to suddenly adopt an alien identity.
They were completely unwitting of this black world in which people can be exfiltrated.
So Mendes wants to find them a plausible reason to be in Iran, which will fool the Iranians, and one which any ordinary English-speaking American can fake.
The key is, if they spoke English, what other possible country wasn't Iran mad at? The answer, of course, is Canada.
Mendes has a hunch that Canada offers the diplomats their best chance. But he's worried that the Canadian government won't break its own protocol and issue citizens from another country fake passports.
Unfortunately, the Canadians had a law that said, you know, you can't just give out passports to anybody. The foreign minister, along with the prime minister, got together and they were able to sort of circumvent the parliament so that they could pass this exception to their laws.
With the Canadian passports secured, next, Mendes now needs a cover story.
He wanted to create a story that was so unbelievable, so crazy and over the top that no one would believe that it was fake.
After endless days and nights searching for the perfect cover story, Mendes hits on an idea. Suppose the diplomats are Canadians who are part of a Hollywood film crew, and their cover story is that they're on a special trip to look at filming locations. Despite the revolution, the cultural sector of the new Iranian government still wants to attract foreign currency, and that includes film investment.
The plan is implausible. It's improbable that it would work. It is fraught with problems, and 1,000 things could go wrong.
Not the least of the problems is that Mendes knows little about Hollywood film crews. So he calls up an old friend in California, John Chambers, an Oscar-winning makeup artist famous for his effects on Planet of the Apes.
So he called his friend, John Chambers, to find out if it would be feasible and what kind of people would go on a location scouting party. And after Chambers ticked off the various jobs that a person would have, Tony realized that it was a perfect solution.
Back in Iran, The escapees are following developments in the ongoing hostage crisis at the US Embassy.
We had an old television, so we did see some footage of the hostages blindfolded and being led around.
You know, they're completely helpless at the mercy of this crowd of people around them pushing them out, and that was pretty scary.
The diplomats have been joined by one more, Lee Schatz, another American working at the embassy, whose escape had been engineered by the Swedes. The 6 are now known as the house guests. After living with the Canadians for what, by Christmas, is now well over 40 days.
The longer that we were in hiding, the more the potential was that we would be found.
Day by day, the danger for the house guests is increasing. Odds are that sooner or later the diplomats will be discovered and turned over to the authorities. It's now a race against time. In early January, Mendes goes to Los Angeles on a 4-day trip to execute the first stage of his elaborate Hollywood ruse by visiting his old friend, John Chambers. With him, $10,000 of CIA cash, hidden in a secret compartment of his briefcase.
Tony had to come out to Los Angeles to try to put this plan into motion. Goes to John Chambers' house, and they sit down.
Mendes turns to Chambers and a colleague of his, Bob Seidel, to help him build up what will look like a genuine Hollywood production from scratch.
Bob was really surprised when he shows up at John Chambers' house, and they're sitting in the breakfast nook, and then here's a CIA officer saying, "We have to rescue some Americans who are stuck on the lam in Tehran." You know, like that was not what he expected that morning.
The 3 work fast and quickly find the script of an unmade film called Lord of Light.
Tony says, this is exactly what we need. It kind of has a Middle Eastern feel to it. So he says, let's call it Argo. And they realize that it also has a kind of mythical connotation. Jason and the Argonauts, it's the ship that the Argonauts sailed on. And Tony says, this is perfect.
With the script problem solved, next, they need a Hollywood office.
We're just coming up here on Sunset Gower Studios. This is the lot that used to be the Columbia lot, actually. And this is where Tony and John Chambers and Bob Seidel took over an office that had just been occupied by Michael Douglas for the China Syndrome, and it was empty, so that's where they set up their fake film production.
Mendes names the production company Studio 6, after the 6 diplomats he must rescue. Chambers and Seidel agree to run it on behalf of the CIA. While in California, Mendes also turns his attention to the minutiae of the operation, collecting what the CIA call pocket litter. Pocket litter refers to all the tiny details which the authorities might check during the escape.
Tony would have had to consider every possibility. Everything from the labels on their clothing down to matchbooks that came from Ottawa, are bits that would be associated either with the movie industry or with Canada. Everything had to support the central cover.
Preparations for the exfiltration do not stop here. When Mendes gets back to OTS offices, he draws on his huge team of CIA technical specialists to work on the details.
He was supported by literally hundreds of people. He had disguise specialists. He had graphics people. He had document validators, how to talk about forgery. He had individuals that could talk about clothing. What would a Canadian film crew look like?
Back in Iran, the house guests have now been in hiding not for days, but months. The endless waiting has begun to unnerve them. And by this stage, any small incident is enough to cause huge alarm.
We had one incident where a helicopter flew low, very low, over the house. It scared us. We were tense. Even though we were in a safe place, it didn't take much to trigger this sort of flight response or panic, whatever you want to call it.
Fear, paranoia, and frustration. Their combined effect begins to wear down the mental state of the trapped diplomats. Their worries are well-founded. Inside the US Embassy, the hostages are being mistreated, even being subjected to terrifying mock executions. Despite the pressure, the house guests do whatever they can just to get through the endless weeks in hiding. This is helped by their Canadian hosts, the Scheerdowns.
The atmosphere that was created by the Scheerdowns through the family kind of setup that we had, the social events that they did for us, I think they helped us as much as possible have a normal life.
I think John realized that in order to keep us mentally healthy, you might say, that there were certain things that they could do. One of them was the routine that we had with the formal dinner and the conversation following. Another was they would have parties for us a couple times a month. They would invite people from other embassies, such as the New Zealanders and the Danish ambassador, people who knew about us, so that we could have normal social interaction with people outside of our very limited circle.
Some of their most memorable occasions include both a Thanksgiving and a Christmas feast, enjoyed in the sumptuous setting of John Scheerdown's diplomatic house.
Due to a strange fluke, the Scheerdowns had stocked their basement with alcohol because they were next in line to host one of these embassy functions that the foreign diplomats would have. Obviously that didn't happen because of the embassy takeover that sort of shut all that stuff down, but the house guests had this abundant supply of wine and liquor and these kinds of things, so they often threw themselves little parties and they drank. But there was also a lot of tension, and there were some tense moments when they were worried about being discovered.
I felt like we were on the Titanic, and that we didn't know when we were going to hit the iceberg, but unlike the people in the real Titanic, we knew that there were icebergs out there and that it was potentially possible that any day we could run into one.
Unable to leave the house and living behind closed doors, the diplomats pass endless hours in whatever way they can. It's just a waiting game.
John Scheerdown had a big library. We did a lot of reading. I read 27 books during that time. I think Mark Lyjak more than doubled that. We played Monopoly, Scrabble, Bridge. You know, there's always the worry in the back of your mind, you know, that we might be caught.
They became a bit stir-crazy. They had to stay inside. There were times when visitors would come over to the house, they would lock themselves in their room, they would hide under the bed. They were very nervous about making an untoward sound, anything that could attract attention.
In Washington, the CIA also feel the pressure. Mendez sets a date for the exfiltration, January 25th, 1980. The risks are so great that rather than send another agent, he'll go there himself. He selects a colleague, codenamed Julio, who speaks Farsi, the language of Iran, to travel with him. The CIA are also in contact with the Canadian ambassador, Kenneth Taylor, who has been protecting the house guests since the start. Soon Mendez will meet them all face to face, and their freedom will pass from the hands of the Canadians to those of the CIA agents. If it all goes wrong and fails, then ultimately their own lives could also be on the line. Almost 3 months since the first day of the diplomats' escape, top intelligence agent Tony Mendez and a colleague codenamed Julio arrive in Iran. Most of this time, the Canadian ambassador has been in secret communication with the CIA and knows they're coming. When they arrive at the Canadian diplomat's house, the house guests have no idea what to expect.
Two gentlemen in trench coats showed up, which was appropriate, of course. Tony introduced himself as Kevin Harkins. There was another gentleman with him, but he stayed in the background pretty much.
The man who calls himself Kevin Harkins, in fact, Tony Mendez, immediately begins to assess the diplomat's mental state after 80 days in hiding.
When Tony joined the group, he selectively and very carefully began to analyze each one of them, saying, who is the individual that I least need to worry about, and who do I need to focus on?
Mendez is looking out for the weakest link, the person most likely to panic during the escape. The house guests are also making an assessment of their own. Can this man really get them out of here? And how?
When Tony offered the Hollywood scenario, I liked it immediately.
They set up an office in Hollywood, and everyone had their business card. And here's mine right here.
The Argo plan impresses most of the house guests, but not all of them are immediately convinced.
I got to admit, I was taken aback by it because it's not something I'd been thinking about for the last 3 months.
The challenge for Mendez is to open the diplomat's eyes to an entirely new illusionary world of falsity and pretense. They must somehow come to terms with playing Hollywood characters that don't exist, except in the eyes of the Iranians. So Mendez plays a small conjurer's trick on them to get them thinking about the deception they'll have to perform themselves to escape.
So he comes in and he performs this little parlor trick that he does with two corks. He holds them in his hand, kind of forming two Ds, and he magically separates them, making it look as if one cork has passed through the other.
And I know it was just a trick, it was just a sleight of hand, but somehow I was kind of amazed by the little hand trick. I thought, well, he can do this, and he's saying he's got all this experience, so I think that we can trust him.
I think he said it's the point of it. It's the whole thing is an illusion, trying to put something over on somebody. You're playing a role, you're a different person, so you're trying to fool somebody, so it's not real, it's an illusion.
These are the very first moments that the master of disguise has with the house guests. Just the beginning of the preparations. He knows the Hollywood plan is a big ask for civilians not used to undercover operations. Even so, Mendez issues them with their aliases, the people they're going to have to pretend to be on the day of the escape. Cora Lyjek is told that she is no longer Mark Lyjek's wife, but the Hollywood scriptwriter, Teresa Harris.
Someone had obviously read our files because my birthday was my mother's month and day, and it was my year. So it was things that I already knew. And I actually went to school with a woman named Teresa Harris, who shares my actual real birthday. I don't know if that's a fluke.
The next day, CIA agents Tony Mendez and Julio drive through Tehran to the Canadian embassy. Here, they have to perform a critical piece of CIA tradecraft, forging the travel documents of the 6 escapees. Watched by the Canadian ambassador, Kenneth Taylor, Mendez forges the travel documents. He needs to create a record of these false identities having entered Iran.
And he'd have had a number of tools. He would have had, of course, a magnifying glass. He would have had a forger's kit. And he would have used what's called the forger's bridge, which is a way to rest his hands on the document that don't smear the ink, but allow him to put in the final details. If they look too perfect, there's something wrong with them. But if they're too haphazard, they may not be believable.
To match the ink used by the Iranian authorities, Mendes uses an ink pad supplied by the CIA. But it has dried up and doesn't work.
Now, here is where the artistic side of Tony comes in. He walks over to Ken Taylor's liquor cabinet. He selects a scotch with a high octane quality. He pours some scotch onto the pad. And sure enough, they come out perfectly.
It's the final day of the escape preparations. Tomorrow, they will head to Tehran's airport and try to flee the country. But Mendes and Julio are not sure that the house guests are adequately prepared.
So on Sunday night, Tony goes back to the Sheerdowns to meet up with the house guests, and he's very surprised by what he sees.
What he sees is that the house guests are scrambling through all their clothes, completely absorbed in the characters they will play. They have to transform themselves from bureaucrats into fashionable Hollywood filmmakers.
Bob Anders, I think, won the prize, though. I mean, he decided to become very flamboyant. I think he unbuttoned his shirt down to about the middle of his chest. Bob has quite a bit of chest hair, so he displayed that prominently.
I'm looking out of my shirt, you know, and I thought, well, maybe if I had some kind of a chain, you know, with a medallion or something, and that would fit, you know, that'd be sort of Hollywoodish. And so then I said, yeah, that's the me, that's the new me, you know, that's Robert Baker, that works for Studio 6.
The house guests begin to enjoy playing their flamboyant Hollywood characters. But Mendes is still concerned that they haven't yet taken on board the full gravity of the escape. So with the help of Roger Lucy, a colleague of the ambassador, he decides to put them through a mock interrogation.
And he took it very seriously. He actually wore these leather boots, he had a camouflage jacket, a little swagger stick. And he got right in their faces.
Roger, he was playing his role as the interrogator. He was playing it to the hilt, so he gave him some kind of a very serious threat. I forget exactly what it was, but something like he was going to be taken away and probably executed. And this gave us all a little start. You know, said, well, yeah, we have to take this thing seriously, and it's not just a game that we're playing.
I think the point was to make sure that we had those answers down so fast that we could spit them out and not give us time to think, to remember. They had to be right there. We had to be able to recall them immediately, and it was effective, I think.
After only 2 days of preparation, Mendes decides the time has come for the diplomats to make a break for it. If he's right, it could be their ticket out. But if he's wrong, their freedom, even their lives, could be on the line. The day of reckoning has arrived. Once the group enters the airport, there will be no turning back.
This was the moment of truth. He knew that this was life or death.
As day breaks, Mendes enters the airport, soon to be followed by the 6 diplomats.
The initial shock of entering a brightly lit, crowded place after being in hiding for 3 months definitely was something to deal with.
After checking in their bags, they face their first big test, getting through passport control. But right from the start, it looks like it could go wrong. Lee Schatz breaks away from the house guests and their agreed plan.
And Lee was sort of standing there, a little nervous. He was beginning to look around, you know, a little worried.
The customs official looks at Lee Schatz's passport photo, notices his mustache, and thinks maybe it's a different person.
Immigrations officer looked at him, looked at his photo, did a double take. And then took his passport and left and went into a back room.
Mendez can only watch from a distance, hoping Schatz won't panic.
Tony's greatest fear was that they would panic, they would break cover, they would confess, refuse to go through the screening process, and literally be frozen by fear. And it's this point, even a tiny bead of sweat running off their forehead could betray the fact that these passports weren't legitimate.
When the official comes back, Schatz tries to explain that he's trimmed his mustache, and it really is him in the photograph.
And he basically told the guy, well, I trimmed my mustache. Then he stamped the passport and he let him go.
After Lee Schatz, the rest of the house guests file through passport control. But the team are not yet through. Ahead, they still face the riskiest part of the escape, presenting their departure forms at final immigration.
All of this work came up to the point is, could the departure forms that they were carrying, would they be matched to the originals?
White forms, in theory, filled in on entry to Iran, but which the escapees don't have, must match the yellow exit forms Mendez has forged. If the officials try to cross-check the forms against each other, it will all go wrong. It's a chance Mendez has to take.
If any one of the 6 had failed, they would not only have been arrested, but Tony likely would have been shot.
You feel very powerless.
When we got to the immigration desk, there was no one there.
Cora went kind of in the back there and started yelling. And nobody came, so she yelled again, and this sleepy-looking guy came out carrying a teapot, and he put the teapot down, and he grabbed our passports, pulled the cards out, handed them back to us. He didn't even look at us at all at any point in this process. And we thanked him, and then we headed off to the departure lounge.
All 6 escapees make it through the critical stage. The official hardly looks at the yellow forms that Mendez has forged. The house guests now assemble in the departure lounge, waiting for their flight call. Then, bad news.
We are sorry to inform you that Swiss Air Flight 363 will be delayed due to mechanical problems.
Something always happens unexpected, and in this instance, it does. The flight is delayed.
The delay means that their chances of being found out are now increasing. Minute after minute, the elite Revolutionary Guards, who Mendez hoped to avoid, are now coming on duty. They're trained to be on the lookout for spies. The delay means that the diplomats must maintain their disguises potentially for hours.
You feel very powerless, and that makes the time drag even longer.
They don't know, are the Revolutionary Guard onto them? Are they scrutinizing the papers? Are they going to be matching the white and yellow copies?
The worry for Mendez is, how long can they maintain their disguises before they give everything away? And can they hold their nerve in front of the feared Revolutionary Guards?
The longer we were there, the greater the chance of somebody recognizing any one of us.
The delayed flight has left the escapees exposed. Kathy, Joe, and Cora Lyjak have more reason to be worried than the others. Because they work in the visa section of the consulate, dealing with Iranians every day, their faces are familiar. They could be spotted at any time.
Kathy, Joe, and I had all worked on the visa line. I was worried that just by coincidence, somebody in the airport would recognize Kathy, Joe, or myself. I don't think we were talking very much. We'd kind of gotten quiet. We'd done everything we could. We just wanted to get out of that room and onto the airplane.
The presence of the Revolutionary Guards, who are now coming on duty, ramps up the pressure to another level.
The departure lounge itself is filling up. As the day is progressing, more and more Revolutionary Guards are coming in. They're beginning to harass the people.
As they wait, Mendez sees that the Revolutionary Guards are stopping other passengers and questioning them.
They're looking for Iranians who are trying to steal wealth and leave the country, but they're starting to turn and look at foreigners as well.
After years of carrying out undercover exfiltrations, Mendez knows that it's in these unexpected moments that the escapees are most likely to panic. They have already begun to make their first mistakes. For Mendez, this is nerve-wracking.
One of the people in the group really didn't want to leave. He felt we were abandoning the hostages. He never really got into the story and the role. In fact, when we went to the waiting room, he called me by my real name, Cora. Mark and I moved away from that person and decided to kind of keep a distance from them.
Another mistake is when a nervous house guest picks up an Iranian newspaper written in the local language of Farsi. It will be highly unlikely for a Hollywood filmmaker to be doing this. Exactly the kind of giveaway a trained Revolutionary Guard would be looking for.
Tony went over to him and said, put the paper down. You should probably not be a Farsi speaker or be able to read it. And he did. He put it down.
Mendez cannot afford a third mistake. Just one glance by a Revolutionary Guard at the wrong moment, and they all go down.
During the delay, Tony could do essentially one thing to assuage the fears of the six, and that's be calm.
Those last 30 minutes in the waiting area seemed to drag on forever. Every minute passing very, very slowly.
When they glanced over at him, they couldn't see panic, they couldn't see fear, only the normal countenance, the rock, the steadiness.
If you could take your blood pressure at each different point along the line, it'd probably be pretty high.
This was kind of a draining experience going through the airport, and I just wanted to be on the aircraft at that stage. That was it.
Finally, at around 8:30 a.m., there's a second announcement.
Passengers for Swiss Air Flight 363 for Zurich, please approach the boarding gate.
Finally, they hear the announcement. Swiss Air Flight is boarding.
We really felt good to actually getting on the bus, going out to the plane. That was beginning to feel that, well, maybe it's really going to work, it's really going to happen.
As they leave, there is no dramatic police chase along the runway. Flight 363 takes off without further incident. few hours later, it lands in Zurich, Switzerland.
I wanted to say thank you and goodbye to Tony, but when I turned around, he was gone.
I'm not even sure we had a chance to shake hands with Tony and Julio. They went off, and for them it was just another day at the office, I guess, but obviously for us it was a life-changing experience.
Tony knows they're going on with their lives, but he knows that this is just one of many operations, and his primary objective at that point is drift off into the shadows.
The Argo escape plan is kept secret for 17 years. The files are eventually declassified, and the world would learn of one of the CIA's most extraordinary operations.
It's the secret story of how the CIA fooled everyone.
Argo is a perfect example of truth being stranger than fiction. I mean, it's hard to imagine that this is real. And I think that was the genius of Argo.
Beirut, 1985.
A car apparently packed with explosive blew up at the entrance to the embassy.
Terrorists are targeting Americans in a series of deadly attacks. Hundreds are dead, and now the CIA's top man in the Middle East has been taken hostage. William Casey, the head of the CIA, decides to throw out the rulebook and strike back.
He wanted to take revenge.
It was totally an off-the-books operation.
In a top-secret mission still denied by the American government, Casey allegedly sanctions the assassination of the man he believes is responsible for the attacks on Americans.
Bill Casey was convinced that Fadlallah was the force behind Hezbollah.
He determined this was a leading terrorist and they were going to get him.
And on March the 8th, 1985, the assassins strike.
It was a car bomb.
They took it into Fadlallah's neighborhood, hoping to kill him.
Based on briefings with the former head of the CIA, this is the top-secret story of the Beirut car bomb. (1983), Beirut, Lebanon. The capital of this tiny Middle Eastern country is being devastated by years of conflict. Now, American troops are arriving in the city. Their mission, not to invade, but to bring peace. Also in the city is a substantial CIA presence. Operating out of the US Embassy, the agents are there to counter a growing problem in Beirut: terrorism. A top-secret meeting has been called to discuss the threat. Chairing the meeting will be the CIA's top Middle East analyst, Robert Ames.
He is a man who was considered to be the key analyst of terrorist organizations and Middle East politics.
Bob Ames was probably the most knowledgeable person in the Middle East.
Ames had previously infiltrated the PLO and has been brought into Beirut secretly to advise on the terrorist threat. Also in the building that day is aid worker Ann Damerel.
When you work in an embassy, everyone knows that CIA agents are there. What you may not know is who they are.
As the classified CIA meeting is gathering, a white van is winding through the Beirut streets to the embassy.
Very few people saw what was coming. It was the calm before the storm.
The funny thing about living in Beirut when I was there, I never dreamt that I would be targeted.
It didn't look like a threat and kind of took everybody off guard.
The driver manages to enter the embassy compound's basement garage. The entire central section of the embassy building collapses in the explosion, bringing down 7 stories of masonry and rubble. Anne Damerel is one of those trapped beneath the wreckage.
I couldn't move anything. I heard, "Yalla bina, yalla bina," let's go, let's go. And I was aware that there were 4 young Lebanese near me. They made like a board, and they moved me out, and they started to run with me across the garden.
Anne's rescue is captured on video. She is one of the lucky ones. "200 people are wounded in the attack. 63 are killed, 17 of them American." News of the embassy bombing rocks America.
CBS Evening News, Dan Rather reporting. The U.S. Embassy in Beirut tonight is a floodlit scene of death and devastation. Much of the 7-story building is rubble, and in that rubble, possibly more victims of a massive terrorist car bomb. The Pentagon says 1 U.S. Marine and 2 U.S. Army soldiers are...
I'm a young Marine then, and I watched this on the news, and my thoughts were, wow, I'm on my way over there.
The embassy being bombed was definitely a shock. I don't think anybody had any idea the kind of defense an embassy really needed against the kind of bombs that could be put together, particularly when you have people willing to die delivering them.
This cowardly act has claimed a number of killed and wounded. It appears that there are some American casualties, but we don't know yet the exact number or the extent of injury.
For the CIA, it is a particularly devastating blow. Half the American dead worked for the agency.
If you look at it from the bomber's point of view, it was an enormous success. It wiped out the CIA station, killed Bob Ames.
His loss was devastating, and the director of the CIA said that Bob Ames was as close to an irreplaceable man as he had ever known in U.S. intelligence.
That director of the CIA is William Casey, and Casey is taking it personally.
Well, Casey obviously was a very intelligent guy. He was a risk taker, and that's different from being a gambler.
He was a very intimidating person if you were afraid of him. He was, had a very short temper. He didn't suffer fools lightly.
In many respects, he was a wild man. He had really no time for the moderates, you know, the make nice people.
Casey directs every CIA resource available to hunt down those responsible for the attack on the U.S. Embassy.
Under CIA Director Casey, the CIA is probably more sophisticated than it ever had been in its history.
Analysts are charged with reviewing thousands of intercepts. Agents are ordered to go to their informants, and dozens of emergency meetings are called for senior CIA officials. But before Casey can get the enemy in his sights, they strike again. Their target? Over 1,800 American Marines stationed in Lebanon as peacekeepers.
The United States had made a decision to put its troops in Lebanon to help stabilize that country.
We were there acting as a liaison between the Lebanese government and the warring militias until the Lebanese government could get on their feet.
They weren't sent there to fight a war. They were to keep the peace. It was a peacekeeping mission.
The majority of the forces are based in barracks situated next to Beirut Airport.
From the rooftop of the building, we could see the main terminal and the mountains and the Mediterranean Sea to the right.
Their position is also dangerously close to an area of Beirut controlled by Muslim militias.
Where it was located was not a choice position for its security.
In the early hours, a truck heads out of Muslim-controlled Beirut on the airport road towards the barracks. At the same time, Marine Lance Corporal Kevin Jiggets is signing off from guard duty.
I went down to my room in the building, And I remember just taking off my boots and laying down.
As Jiggets lies down to sleep, the van approaches the perimeter of the barracks.
This truck came down Airport Road. He turned into the parking lot of the main terminal, and he crashed through a barbed wire barrier.
As a peacekeeping force, the Marines' weapons are not loaded. The face of the driver is visible to the guards as he aims the truck at the barracks. He is smiling.
It drove into this big building that was a barracks.
The initial contact with the truck and the guard shack is what woke me up.
The truck rams into the base of the barracks and is primed to explode.
And I reach for my weapon when I said, "It's showtime, ladies," and that's the last thing I remember.
It is the largest non-nuclear explosion since the Second World War.
Upon detonation, the building was lifted from its foundation and kind of pancaked down floor after floor.
The entire building is leveled.
We had never seen anything like this. It was an iconic bombing.
The truck was laden with approximately 12,000 pounds of explosives.
It was a pretty simple thing, a very large vehicle packed with explosives, got up to the front of the barracks and was exploded. It wasn't very complicated.
It was a beautifully done operation.
The next thing I remember was 2 white Marines were removing rubble from me. I didn't feel any pain until they picked me up.
Both of Jigget's legs are broken, and he suffers burns and cuts over his entire body. All that remains of the 9-story building is rubble.
Prior to 9/11, it was the largest terrorist attack against U.S. personnel in the history of the United States.
241 American soldiers were killed. 240 of them were Marines.
It is the biggest single loss of American servicemen's life since Iwo Jima.
I know there are no words that can express our sorrow and grief over the loss of those splendid young men. Likewise, there are no words to properly express our outrage, and I think the outrage of all Americans, at the despicable act.
In Washington, William Casey and the CIA are now under real pressure to find the terrorists. The problem is that no one has yet claimed responsibility. But within hours of the attack, a statement is released to a French news agency by a group calling themselves Islamic Jihad, Arabic for Holy War. The group say they are responsible for both the attack on the Marines and for another simultaneous attack in the city, which has claimed the lives of 58 French soldiers. But no one in Washington has ever heard of Islamic Jihad.
When the Islamic Jihad claimed the bombing, we knew absolutely nothing about it. It was not an organization that we even knew existed.
The CIA was caught completely off guard. We did not have the structure internally to handle that kind of threat.
We didn't know where it was, what it was. We didn't know who was behind it.
William Casey is determined that the CIA will find out and bring the perpetrators of this terrible crime to justice. And according to some, he will go beyond the law to do so. The man Casey selects to uncover those responsible is seasoned Middle East agent Robert Bayer. Anxious not to lose more operatives, Bayer's brief is simple.
When I left Washington, the orders were stay alive. Whatever you do, stay alive. We don't care if you ever send a report in. We don't care what you do. Just don't get killed or kidnapped. It was very simple orders.
Bayer sets off and finds Beirut a city in turmoil.
There was no other way in except a Black Hawk helicopter. We came in over the sea about 10 feet. The helicopter drops down so that there's spray going everywhere. And you're coming in about 200 miles an hour. There's shelling. Parts of Beirut are burning. It was the ninth circle of hell.
Beyer and the other agents immediately begin to set up a low-profile operation.
This was Lebanon, you know, it was a civil war. You just absolutely wanted to be the least important person on the street. We didn't wear suits, always Levi's, scuff shoes. You never carried a radio in the open. You never carried a gun in the open. You looked like you were a bum that just sort of wandered off from wherever. We drove beat-up old cars with bullet holes in them, with bald tires. You know, if you change your car every day, that was the best way to do it. At one point, I actually drove a taxi there. It was an old Mercedes, it was been painted a bunch of time, all dinged up, and it looked like what's called a service. There were just no limits, no laws. It was amazing. We had all the money we wanted. We would, at the drop of a hat, buy an apartment. I had probably 12 apartments and houses and moved between them night after night. So you were never in the same place.
As a fluent Arabic speaker, Beyer is assigned the role of gathering intelligence on the streets.
It was mainly picking up sources in cars, and we would put surveillance on places, watch people coming and going.
Gradually, Beyer's intelligence work starts to pay off. He begins to gather information on Islamic Jihad. And that intelligence leads him to the religious leaders of one of Lebanon's main Islamic sects, the Shias.
We knew that there was a grouping of Shia clerics that had started in 1982, and we watched this formation occur. You know, people would join and leave. Names we didn't know much about, but basically the religious establishment was coming to join in this Islamic resistance movement.
The Shia sect are in the minority in the Muslim world, but in Lebanon, they make up around half the Muslim population. And critically, they are the same branch of Islam as America's key enemy in the Middle East, Iran. Despite limitless CIA resources, Beyer's efforts to penetrate Islamic Jihad now hit a brick wall.
These people were very, very good. They never showed themselves. They worked out of tenements in Beirut. They didn't have a name, they didn't have an office, they didn't keep phone numbers.
What we began to find out was that they were very sophisticated in the structure of their organization, and in my opinion, they were almost as good as we are.
They were strictly family-based, impossible to penetrate.
So William Casey decides to turn to America's only friend in the region, Israel.
Israel is a very, very close ally, both politically and in intelligence areas, and so we work with them really as our intelligence and political brothers and sisters, really.
The Israeli intelligence service, Mossad, is conducting its own operations in Lebanon. Mossad pass on to Casey what they know. The Israeli report says that an organization inside Lebanon is involved. The Israelis identify a house in Damascus, the capital of neighboring Syria, where they say a Syrian intelligence officer discussed the attacks on the Marines 3 days before the bombing. Present at the meeting was a grandfatherly man with a black turban and brown robes. The Israelis say he is the key figure in the militant Shiite movement in Lebanon, Sheikh Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah.
The intelligence the CIA and the Israelis developed showed that Sheikh Fadlallah, a Shiite militant, was At the center and involved, allegedly, in at least the main bombings in Beirut, including the attack on the Marine barracks.
Fadlallah was born and raised in Iraq, but has spent his adult life in Lebanon. He is an open critic of America's presence in the region.
Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah naturally became a part of the anti-Western coalition, if you like. You know, he's an Ayatollah. He would give blanket fatwas saying, yeah, it's fine to use force to drive out an occupying power.
Casey becomes convinced that Fadlallah has to be connected to the bombings and is a leading figure in Islamic Jihad. At last, Casey has a target. According to some, Casey now sets in motion an operation to assassinate the man who he believes ordered the slaughter of hundreds of Americans. In the months after the barracks bombing, President Reagan reassures the world that America will stay the course.
The people of Lebanon must be given the chance to resume their efforts to lead a normal life, free from violence, without the presence of unauthorized foreign forces on their soil. And to this noble end, I rededicate the efforts of the United States.
But the truth is that neither the American military or the American people have any desire to be embroiled in another Vietnam.
The military decided that no longer were they going to let the politicians dribble them into a war, and a war that the public doesn't support.
I think the American public were sick of the killings.
But CIA Director William Casey is considering an operation against the Lebanese cleric Sheikh Mohammed Fadlallah, who he suspects is the leader of the terrorist organization behind the attacks on Americans. But before he can strike back, there is a further humiliation for America. Just 4 months after the bombing of the US Marines, America begins a full withdrawal of its forces from Lebanon. Many in the CIA believe it is sending the wrong message to the terrorists.
Pulling Marines out of Beirut was viewed as a victory by the bad guys, writ large.
It was sending a signal to terrorists in the region that the Reagan administration was a paper tiger.
Casey decides that it is up to the CIA to exact revenge for this loss of face.
Casey felt defeated because he was part of the administration that convinced Reagan to go in, to send the Marines in.
But to strike back, he must first rebuild the agency's damaged capabilities in Lebanon. Casey's first action is to send in a new station chief, William Buckley.
Buckley was a great man, a very solid fella. His expertise was in paramilitary operations.
Buckley, a former commando who had fought in Vietnam, will be the CIA's most important man on the ground in Beirut. Casey promises to provide Buckley with everything he needs to combat the terrorist threat posed by Islamic Jihad. Buckley steps up CIA paramilitary training, hostage rescue, and VIP protection. He trains Lebanese intelligence agents to work alongside his teams. Back at CIA headquarters in Langley, Casey has 50 highly trained analysts working exclusively on Islamic terrorism in the Middle East. Out of this massively expanded operation, Buckley and Casey learn a vital piece of intelligence.
It takes a lot of time to figure out what's going on. We figured that the Islamic Jihad was an organization that they just borrowed a name.
It emerges that Islamic Jihad is not a single body. It is the name for a loose network of Shiite militant groups. The CIA learns that just one of these groups is responsible for the attacks on American targets. That group will become one of the most dangerous and radical organizations to ever emerge from the Middle East. But in 1984, they are only just starting to refer to themselves by name. They call themselves the Party of God. In Arabic, Hezbollah.
Everybody talks about Hezbollah today. At the time, I never heard of Hezbollah.
In April 1983, we had no idea that there would be a Hezbollah. In fact, there was no name for it.
It is only now, after the bombings, that the group starts to use their notorious name. Hezbollah has been created by America's greatest enemy in the region, Iran. In 1982, its spiritual leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, had sent 1,000 Iranian Revolutionary Guards to train Shiite fighters in Lebanon.
Hezbollah was created by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. There's just no doubt about this. They funded it, they organized it.
And now Hezbollah is fighting Iran's war in Lebanon.
It was an extension of the Iranian Revolution, if you like. It was Iran's effort to open out the revolution to the Arab world, and they did it very successfully. And Lebanon was the first place.
The CIA discovers that Iran is training Hezbollah fighters on the Lebanese-Syrian border. Soon, they receive other vital intelligence. Both the Lebanese security forces and Israel's Mossad inform the CIA that a senior figure in the Hezbollah power structure is none other than Sheikh Mohammed Fadlallah. The same man who Casey believes is behind the attacks on the US Embassy and Marine barracks. Casey becomes convinced that the best way to strike at Hezbollah and send a clear signal to America's enemies is to kill Fadlallah. But Casey faces a complication. Targeted assassinations are against the law.
During Watergate, Gerald Ford, the president, issued an executive order banning assassinations by any agency, including the CIA. So in the 80s, Casey's hands were tied, and so he stretched the law.
In Washington, Casey turns to the CIA's formidable legal team to try to convince President Reagan to change the law. His argument is that a preemptive strike against Fadlallah should be seen as an act of self-defense.
In other words, if you'd gotten rid of Hitler in the 30s, maybe 20 million people wouldn't have died in World War II. And that's a pretty good argument.
Back in Beirut, William Buckley has a much more immediate problem to deal with. The terrorists have started taking hostages.
Hezbollah had started kidnapping individual Americans with a view to getting the United States out of the Middle East.
Groups of armed men are seizing Westerners, especially Americans, from the streets of Beirut. Casey realizes that the CIA needs to act. So Buckley starts formulating a daring rescue plan.
He wanted to set up paramilitary operations. He said, let's get people on the ground, let's get Delta Force there, we're going to rescue these people.
Buckley's plan is that the Green Berets and Israeli Special Forces will enter the city by boat under the cover of darkness. Simultaneously, in the city, Mossad agents will cause a diversion by placing bombs outside the homes of suspected Islamic terrorists. Then the Green Berets will make their way to a series of suspected locations and conduct stealth raids to rescue the hostages and take out the terrorists. Dangerous and daring though the plan is, Buckley believes that the very nature of such a surprise assault will be what ensures its success. On March the 15th, 1984, Casey gives Buckley the green light. But before he can put his plan into action, Hezbollah will strike again. And this time, the terrorists are coming after the CIA themselves. Since arriving in Beirut, Buckley has been having an affair with a beautiful young Lebanese woman called Zenoub. Unbeknown to Buckley, Zenoub works for Hezbollah. Monitoring every detail of Buckley's personal routine, she passes on the intelligence to the Hezbollah leadership.
Buckley was very predictable in his routine going to and from the embassy, and he was warned by a ranking military official to, look, stop doing that because you're putting yourself at risk.
Buckley ignores the warning, believing he is safe from attack and oblivious to Zenoub's true identity. On a Friday morning, William Buckley leaves his Beirut apartment, carrying top-secret documents. Taking the elevator to the basement garage, he is joined by a well-dressed man. In the basement, the man suddenly strikes.
They hit him over the head with a briefcase with something hard in it. They grabbed him, threw him in the back of a trunk of a car, and drove off into the southern suburbs.
For Casey, the kidnapping of the Beirut station chief is an unprecedented disaster.
This was a real earthquake for Casey and the CIA.
William Buckley was a chief of station and had volumes of CIA information in his head, in his memory. And the accounts were that Hezbollah was torturing Buckley daily.
In September, proof that Buckley is still alive is released to the CIA by his kidnappers.
There appeared eventually a video that Casey saw of Buckley being tortured.
He was almost dead. He was slobbering. You could barely understand what he was saying. The concern was the amount of classified information that was being tortured out of Station Chief Buckley. It was causing serious damage to national security.
Buckley's Lebanese agents began to vanish or turn up dead. With the loss of their station chief and their intelligence network in Lebanon clearly compromised, Casey fears the agency's entire operation in the Middle East is in ruins.
It showed the limits of American power. The United States was not able to protect its intelligence representatives abroad. And Hezbollah was able to hold this man, and the United States apparently couldn't do anything about it.
For one of their own to be tortured and killed that way, and then for the video to get to Casey and the CIA, it galvanized this idea of we have to fight back, and if our hands are going to be tied, if there are rules, if there are laws, if there are executive orders, to hell with them, we're going to get the job done.
And any doubt that Casey may have about hitting back at the terrorists is removed when they strike yet again. A Hezbollah car bomb targets the US Embassy Annex building. 24 are killed and 90 are wounded. But this time, the CIA link the attack to Hezbollah. Casey turns to remarkable top-secret CIA aerial photographs, which show a van identical to the one used in the attack at a Hezbollah training camp in the Lebanese desert. The photographs reveal an exact mock-up of the protective concrete barriers at the embassy annex, and between the obstacles, tire tracks.
If they looked carefully enough, the outline of the drive that had to be made was exactly what you saw right in front of the United States Embassy Annex in Beirut.
It is beyond doubt. The Iranians are running a car bomb school for Hezbollah terrorists. In Washington, Casey makes his position clear. They must cut off the head of the Hezbollah snake and kill the man they believe to be its leader, Sheikh Fadlallah.
In November of 1984, President Reagan signed something called a finding. Finding is a document that means the president has found that a certain top secret activity is in the interests of national security.
The finding does not mean that the CIA can carry out assassinations, but it does mean that they can train local units who potentially can. This gives Casey some room for maneuver. Casey can now sanction the killing, but the CIA must still not be directly involved. Veteran journalist Bob Woodward claims that this is precisely what Casey does next.
It was totally an off-the-books operation. The CIA was not directly involved, though Casey himself personally was.
Covert action has always been available to presidents when they do not wish to use the United States military.
According to Woodward, Casey hunts for a third party to execute the assassination.
William Casey looked elsewhere to find a partner to launch a strike against the leadership of Hezbollah in Lebanon. And that partner was Saudi Arabia.
Although denied by Saudi Arabia and the American government, according to Woodward, in early 1985, the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the US, Prince Bandar, is ordered by his king to cooperate with Casey in every respect.
Casey and Bandar met in one of these classic CIA secret meetings at Bandar's house and walked out into the garden.
According to Woodward, the Saudis, like Casey, believe that Sheikh Fadlallah is the leader of Hezbollah, and so agree to fund the operation.
Casey gave Bandar a card with the bank account number and said, transfer the $3 million for this operation into this account.
Casey agrees to the Saudis taking operational control, and they agree to using a former British SAS officer to head the mission.
It was Saudi intelligence, a former SAS officer, and Casey, and they planned this operation.
The SAS officer arrives in Beirut. To keep the CIA out of the picture, he recruits Lebanese agents to carry out the mission.
The goal here was to get the Lebanese to do the work, your boots on the ground, if you will, to try to find Hezbollah's leaders and deal with them.
The plan is simple: to strike at Fadlallah using the weapon of the terrorists.
You know, irony of ironies, made a car bomb.
One agent is ordered to procure a large quantity of explosives. Another is to choose the vehicle. Money is paid to informants to make sure that they know where Fadlallah will be at a certain time. The man chosen to drive the vehicle is Eli Habika, the leader of a Christian militia group. The bomb will be set off by a timed remote, which Habika will activate before leaving the scene. Everything is set. The team is given the green light, and the operation to kill Fadlallah is set in motion. A pickup truck is driven into the crowded Bir al-Abed neighborhood in South Beirut. Concealed beneath crates of vegetables, 750 pounds of explosives. The truck is parked across the road from Sheikh Fadlallah's house. Intelligence says that Fadlallah will soon be returning there from the mosque. Lookouts are positioned to alert the driver of the truck, Eli Habika, of Fadlallah's departure. A At approximately 2 p.m., Fadlallah leaves the mosque after Friday prayers. One of the lookouts identifies Fadlallah, and the signal is relayed to Habika to prepare the bomb for detonation. But then a woman stops Fadlallah. She asks a religious question. They need to delay the detonation. Fadlallah is too far from the bomb. But it's too late. The blast kills 83 people. 283 lie wounded. The victims are mainly schoolgirls, women, and children. Buildings up to 600 feet away are destroyed. Despite the size of the explosion, the bombers have missed their target. Fadlallah is just outside the blast radius. Surrounded by his supporters, the cleric simply walks away.
They did not kill him. They killed 80 innocent people, and Fadlallah escaped.
Those at the scene are under no illusion as to who is behind the attack. At CIA headquarters, Casey receives word that the operation has gone horrifically wrong.
This bombing of Fadlallah was a turning point. I mean, anybody had any doubts about the West were immediately convinced that these guys are crazy. They're going to slaughter us and kill us all for no purpose at all.
And worse is to come. It later transpires that the CIA's intelligence on Fadlallah from Israeli and Lebanese sources is deeply flawed. The man the CIA had targeted for death is not the head of Hezbollah. Over the next few years, the agency learns that Fadlallah has never been involved in any terrorist attacks against America.
There was no evidence, none, zero at all, that he was directly involved in attacks on the West or Israel. He was not an active operational member of Hezbollah, never at any time.
To this day, Prince Bandar and both the Saudi Arabian and American governments deny any involvement in the attempt on Fadlallah's life. They say that rogue Lebanese militias undertook the operation alone. And those who worked alongside Casey at the highest levels of the CIA also claim he was not involved.
I think a lot of people have ascribed it to something that Casey put together with whatever, and that's not true. Casey had nothing to do with it.
Despite these public denials, it appears that William Casey himself is prepared for the story of his personal involvement to go public. In the years before his death in 1987, Casey agrees to a series of interviews with award-winning reporter Bob Woodward.
I met with Casey and talked to him 48 times. I talked to him on the phone, traveled with him on his CIA plane when I was the only one with him, had dinner with him in his house, had breakfast with him in his house.
Woodward eventually reveals Casey's involvement in the botched assassination attempt in his book, Veil, The Secret Wars of the CIA.
Now, why Casey would tell Bob Woodward this story, I don't know.
I think Casey talked to Woodward quite openly to leave a legacy behind and let people know what he wanted them to know.
Over the years, there has been speculation as to why Casey would talk to Woodward. Many people believe it was because Casey wanted to ensure that the CIA would learn from its mistakes in Beirut.
We underestimated our enemy in that case, and it came back to bite us.
Prior to 9/11, the terrorist attack on the Marine compound in 1983 was the largest terrorist attack against Americans in the history of the United States.
Because of intelligence failures in 1983, hundreds of Americans, including 241 Marines, lost their lives. It is a loss that many refuse to forget.
Beirut lives in the hearts of Beirut veterans because there's not been a day that's gone by that I don't think about it and I don't remember it.
Casey, too, was adamant that the deaths of the Marines, the CIA agents, and embassy staff who died in the previous bombing would not be in vain. The CIA desperately needed to employ more effective tactics against the extremists.
Casey figured out that we had to do something better about combating terrorism.
The critical lesson that Casey learned was that the CIA needed to find ways of getting better intelligence on its enemies and finding more accurate ways of killing them. So a year after the Fadlallah attack, Casey sets up a new CIA department, the Counterterrorism Center.
It brought together the espionage people and the people from the Directorate of Intelligence to work together for virtually the first time in history. And this was a revolution.
This revolution at the agency ensures that, unlike in Beirut, the CIA will now always try to have its own agents on the ground, providing highly accurate intelligence direct to the CIA's best analysts. They will no longer need to repeat the mistakes of Beirut, where they were forced to rely on foreign intelligence and local Lebanese to carry out their missions. In 1986, the Counterterrorism Center starts developing a new way to accurately target its enemies: an unmanned aerial vehicle.
That was the beginning of where we are today with the lethal drones. That was the genesis right there.
This idea, born out of a failure of such tactics as the car bomb, would result in the development of highly sophisticated, lethal drones. It would take a generation to be perfected, but drones are now an integral and highly effective weapon in the CIA's campaign against terrorism.
It is a new era, and if you think about what Casey was dabbling in with Sheikh Fadlallah, it's small change compared to what goes on now.
The CIA continues to evolve in the face of new terrorist threats and has achieved some startling successes. In many cases, the extent of those successes are only now becoming declassified.